Okay, I'm Kelly Ortega, and today I will be presenting the results of our work in progress on a risk assessment for managing fishing impacts in the southern Benguela system in South Africa. So I want to start providing some context and first the foundation of the work that we've been developing in terms of ecosystem assessment in South Africa come from the National Biodiversity Assessment, which are like ecosystem assessments. And these basically identify cumulative pressure, and they map cumulative pressures across all marine sectors in South Africa and across different ecosystem types. So if you look at the maps that are on this slide, the one on the top shows the outputs from the National Biodiversity Assessment, or NBA, from 2011, and the one on the bottom shows the results from the one in 2018. So if you look at the map on the bottom, you will see that those areas on red are those that represent the highest pressures, or the highest cumulative pressures in the marine ecosystems, and you will see that those are concentrated around the coast, no, you can see the coast, and also around the shelf area. So the latest National Biodiversity Assessment is the one from 2018. There's one that is being developed now, but it will only be available next year. And the latest assessment found 21 key findings, and those spread around the different status of marine ecosystems and species, and importantly, identify 31 ocean sectors that were exerting the highest pressures on the South Africa marine ecosystem. And these include the different fishing sectors, which we have 22 subsectors within the fishing system, but we also have mining, oil and gas, pollution, and also invasive species across the other sectors. The NBA also identifies some critical knowledge gaps. So, for instance, of all of the species that are harvested in South Africa, only 10% of those have a non-stock status. And from those, about 40% are actually overfished. So there was also another critical knowledge gap identified, was that the lack of information on climate impacts on our marine ecosystem. And the MBA also suggested that there's a need to develop tools that can identify trade-off between these different sectors, but also help achieve ecological, social, and economic benefits under uncertainty. So the work we're doing here aims to address a few of these challenges. And for this, we use the hierarchical risk assessment framework that was established through Mission Atlantic and consists of two steps. The risk scoping, that is based on some of the information that I presented just now on the National Biodiversity Assessment. So basically it started from all of the risk available for the marine ecosystem, and then identify the key risk sectors, pressures, and ecosystem components for the system. And this was done through a literature review scoping, but also through stakeholder workshops. And then we moved to the next step, that was the quantitative risk assessments, which basically customize the assessment for all of the different case studies in Mission Atlantic, but also to stakeholder needs. And for this, we use the Bayesian Belief Networks. So here are the results of the risk scoping that was done for South Africa. This work was led by Lisa Skane from Zambia in South Africa, and they basically, as I mentioned, started with all of the risk available, also sectors available for the system, and they used the ODEMM framework that it has been used extensively in Mission Atlantic. And then, as you can see here, we have like sectors, pressures, and ecosystem components, and all of those with the highest width for the bands or the height are the sectors that impose the highest risk to the ecosystem, or the pressure of ecosystem components, and these are organized from the ones that have the highest risk to the bottom with the lowest impact. So this work identified that was fishing, shipping, and coastal infrastructure as the sectors imposing the highest risk in South Africa, and the pressures associated to these sectors were bycatch, species extraction, and incidental loss, and they have the highest impacts on ecosystem components like the demersal elasmobranch, pelagic fish, and deep sea elasmobranchs. So these results, as I mentioned, were validated with the stakeholders, and through some of those workshops, the stakeholders mentioned that the non-renewable sector, specifically oil and gas, was of high concern for our system, and they wanted to see this sector included into the work related to Mission Atlantic, especially on the interactions between the oil and gas sector and other sectors, for instance, fishing. So based on this resource, we selected the fishing sector and the oil and gas sector as the key sectors to include on our risk assessment work. So here I just want to show you some work that was done after also implementing also using the ODEMM methodology, but in this case also only focus on the fishing sector in South Africa. So this work was done by Jürgen Bormann and colleagues. And then they segregated the South African fishing sector into 17 different subsectors. And then also mapped the pressures and the impacts on ecosystem components. And they found that the demersal troll sector and their two subsectors, the offshore and inshore sectors, were the ones that were imposing the highest impacts or risk in the ecosystem. And again, this was associated to extraction of species, bycatch, and incidental loss. And the highest impacts were on the demersal and pelagic teleost. So other important sectors that were identified through this work was the landfish sector that in South Africa targets several species and also has different, even more subsectors within. And also the recreational sector, for which, they impose a lot of pressure in terms of catches, but the sector has basically no information available and it's like not very well managed. And this work used data from 1961 to about 2010 to do the assessment, and they divided the risk assessment into 3 different time periods of 21 years. And the demersal sector was consistently the sector that imposed the highest pressure on the ecosystem throughout all of those different time periods, despite all of the management measures that they have implemented and the real work that they are doing to try to integrate more ecosystem components and also reduce like bycatch and the other impacts on the system. So then, in line with the hierarchical risk framework that you saw, we moved to the second step that was more quantitative. So in this case, we use Bayesian Belief Networks, and we started from the sectors that we determined, in this case, fishing. And then basically these Bayesian Belief Networks were selected because they are relatively easy to communicate when in cases of uncertainty, and they are defined as probabilistic directed networks. So basically, because the arrows just direct or show a direction between a node, which in blue is the parent node, and then you have a child node, which is the one that is being affected by the parent node. These networks, they have the different nodes or the different variables, and they all of them have a table associated, and each of the nodes has a state. So in this case, the state can be low and high, but they need to be like different. And all of those states have like a probability of in which state you found it. So as you see on the table, in this case, for that particular node, we will have the lowest state is in a 40% probability and the highest state on a 60% probability. So these networks also are relatively good to use, again, as I mentioned, in uncertainty context, but they can use both quantitative data and qualitative data or a combination of both. So they prove quite useful, for instance, to be used in specific situations when there's not much data available. So here we move to the results of our actual fishing BBN. You will see that this network has 17 variables in total, and we try to include information from environmental indices, those in green on the top, so basically primary production and temperature. Then we selected 2 fishing nodes, so the demersal fishing sector, because as you saw, those are the ones that have the highest impact on the marine ecosystem in South Africa. But we also include the pelagic sector because this sector was really important, or still is in the country. It used to have the highest catches in the whole of South Africa, and also targets 2 species of really high importance for the ecosystem, which is sardine and anchovy. So those were the 2 main fleets that we selected for this work, and the species that are targeted by these sectors either directly or as bycatch. And then in yellow are the catch nodes, and then we selected 3 ecosystem service nodes, which is the biodiversity. In this case, we use an ecosystem indicator that is like the proportion of predatory fish, because we have data available in some time series on this indicator, livelihoods as the number of jobs, and food provision basically as catch potential. So we use time series from 1978 to 2015 and a combination of both observations and model data. Our time series are quite patchy. They don't have like full representation for most of the different nodes, but given that we have data available, we use a learning algorithm to determine the different states of each of the nodes, but also the probabilities in which of those nodes were available. So after having the network constructed and the probability tables determined by this learning algorithm, we did 2 specific runs so far, and these results are really preliminary. But the first one was we assumed a scenario of very high primary productivity with warming temperatures and fishing efforts. So we concentrate in these 4 nodes because those are the parent nodes or the drivers. And you can see them on the top, and then you see that there's red bars explaining that the state is on 100%, so it's completely on that stage. And in most cases, they are on the bottom, representing that is the higher state, so higher temperature, higher primary production. So as a summary, because I'm not going to walk through all of these results, this first calibration run resulted in a higher probability of having lower biomass of small pelagics, which kind of makes sense given that the small pelagic fishing effort was quite high. And this resulted in median levels of seabirds and marine mammals biomass. And this also resulted in a slightly higher probability of good livelihoods. If you see it on the bottom, there's like more or less they are like even between like the lower state and the higher. This is that we don't have that much data for the livelihoods, so we only have like 2 states for this particular node, so the states are quite broad, so this still needs a little bit more refinement. And then we found a higher probability of good food provisioning. When we basically tested the same run, but we changed, the only thing that we changed was the primary productivity. So instead of having a high primary production level, we went to a lower primary production level, as you can see on the top node there on that side. Then the results were quite similar, but the main difference was that we found higher probability of the small pelagic biomass being on a median state. So as you can see then the kind of like the blue box on the middle and on the second row, and this resulted in a much higher biomass level of seabirds, but much in intermediate levels of marine mammals, which are, if I haven't mentioned that, like directly prey on small pelagics. Then this, in terms of the ecosystem services, resulted in a very high food provisioning, so much higher catches. But the livelihoods were basically show minimal difference between the previous scenario and the next one. So these calibration runs, as I mentioned, are still very preliminary, and they need much more fine-tuning. But so far from what we can see from our results is that primary production is a very important node driving the dynamics of this system. And in terms of like the insights and next steps, as I've mentioned, there's a very strong ecosystem response linked to primary production. And some ecosystem components, like for instance, the seabirds, are not yet responding according to the expected knowledge of the system. So we need to do like some more testing. We're hoping to compare outputs to available data. We've been waiting for data from the government department since, I think, February. And we are still waiting for the data, so then we can actually like divide the available data into like training data sets for the BBM, but also test data sets. At the moment, the time series are short and we don't have enough data to do that split and to be able to do like some more deep testing of the BBN. We need to do some more sensitivity analysis, and we are hoping to include some future projections of primary productivity and temperature on the BBN, so then we can also look at potential climate impacts on ecological components and ecosystem services. As I mentioned, the BBN is now trained to like past conditions, but we want to include like future impacts too. And then we're hoping to merge the fishing and oil and gas Bayesian Belief Network, that's Sarina, that it's somewhere there, has been developed. And when we have those two ready, we will be able to test cumulative impacts and trade-offs on the marine ecosystem, and also see if there are any potential conflicts or benefits coming from those interruptions. And I think that's it, because I don't have more time.
Thank you. Thank you also to keep the time.
Yeah, I was trying.
I can start maybe just with a quick one. I like the approach where you put the primary production and temperature as two forcing in the BBN type of approach, also because it can give you some handles to introduce climate change in it. What about connectivity to other areas? Isn't that kind of major
Yes, that's an important one, and I mean that was one of the things that we discussed, because these BBNs are like non-spatial, and we are like in a lot of the cases looking at spatial issues. I think that maybe the bigger VBN or the general VBN that SUSA was working in, that includes more aspects in terms of movement, where we can maybe simulate connectivity. I don't think in this one, at least we haven't managed to do that. We do discuss with Sarinas on a stage to look maybe at potential overlap when we merge the VBNs between like the fishing footprint and then the oil and gas footprint. That could maybe address that point, but so far we have not done that, yeah.
questions? Ken first, and then Marcos, if you are quick.
When you do your calibration runs, is there a time component? How long does it take, for primary production to make its way to the other end of the food chain, or is this just all happens simultaneously?
So these BBNs are trained like on time series, and then they are like basically just past conditions in this case. But I mean, like the simulation time is relatively quick, and then we just like discretize the system and all of that variability into states. So I will say that for those particular models as like quite direct. It's not like with our ecosystem models that takes a longer time to see like impacts, but for our small pelagics, for instance, like primary production changes result in quite quick changes in like biomasses or recruitment. So there's not that much lag.
Marcos?
Hi, Kelly. We are doing very similar things in West Africa, and I would love to know more how you parameterized livelihoods. What is included in that box?
Yes, sorry if I meant to mention it's number of jobs. So we were digging for data on like census for the marine, for the fishing sector, marine fishing, and also some aquaculture data, but the data is very sparse, and it's not like a complete full census on the sector. There's like some patchy data, and then that's mixed with like some surveys that the government, the labor department does to get like some numbers. So we have a few census data, and then also some like more broad surveys to get those numbers. But those need, as I mentioned, need further refinement, because there's not much data and our states are very broad. So I think we want to see more like clear outputs or like from the BBN, then we will have to maybe like get to more states to try to get a bit better data. But it was a first attempt to try to incorporate some ecosystem services into the network.
Yeah, last one. I think we have time in case. Or while Mamadou maybe is coming up, we can have one. I was actually curious about the oil and gas sector. You say that they asked to...
Yeah, the stakeholders asked when we were having a meeting. I think Isabel was there when we have this Mission Atlantic and all of the different Atlantic projects. There was a lot of interest from the stakeholders, like to see the mining sector and the oil and gas included on the BBNs. And they wanted to see how they interacted. So they specifically asked for that, yeah.
And you had meetings with them, the industry sector?
We had meetings with the industry, like the fishing industry, at different stages. But at that meeting, there was representatives from the Department of Fisheries, Forestry, and then also some academic stakeholders, but there are also people that work directly with people, like from the social aspects and the potential conflict of like people being removed from areas to give access to mining. And so it was more like sectors that could be, what is the word? I just went out of my head. But I mean, that could be affected because, the people will have mining concessions and then they will be removed from that area and like their access to the ocean will be not there anymore. Or like they could lose their connection to culture and also like livelihoods. So that's what they would ask for those sectors to be included.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for that. And I think the next speaker is, yeah, thanks.